Hello everyone. Today I wanted to take a look at Pashasana, the very first pose of the Ashtanga Yoga Intermediate series. So this is a very interesting asana in that it's a tiny package that has a lot going on with it. So it can look very simple, but it can have many challenges inside of this particular pose. At least that was my personal experience. I have introduced some students to this pose, and they knocked it out of the park their first attempt. But for some of us, it might take different stages to work through. And I just want to take a look at troubleshooting Pashasana as it is the gateway going into our intermediate series practice. Now, one thing that you're going to discover is that I find that Pashasana is like the next step out of something like a Marchasana D. If we were to compare both positions, Marchasana D, we're twisting deeply, and then we're binding our arm around one knee. However, in Pashasana, we are also twisting the torso, but we are binding around two knees while we're in this squat position with feet together, which makes it, of course, much more challenging. So binding around one knee can be challenging, but binding around two is even more challenging, of course. So this is going to be like that next step, that next challenge to work through. So I find that when I introduce students to Pashasana, that the bind is usually pretty accessible because practitioners, students have already worked through the Marchasana positions in primary series. So if they've completed those markers in the practice, when they come to Pashasana, it doesn't mean it'll be super easy, but at least they will have the tools to navigate the deeper challenge of something like a Pashasana. Again, we're binding around those two knees, which is very opening for not only that twist in the torso, but just very opening for the shoulders. So to complete that bind can take high level technique. You might need a little bit of assistance at first if you're attempting it, but it should be approachable if we've completed that Marchasana D. Now, the other element to this is being in a squat with the knees together and the feet together, heels flat to the floor. And to be honest with you, getting those heels flat to the floor for some body types might be highly, highly challenging. I know that when I first started practicing Pashasana, I did not have my heels flat to the floor. Eventually, that did happen over time, but it just didn't happen at first, but I was able to do the bind. So the bare minimum for Pashasana is we want to at least have that bind. There's a possibility that your heels might still be elevated off the floor, and that will be okay to work within for a time. With that being said, I would still do all that you can to just get those heels flat over time. I personally just didn't give up. Even though my heels were far away from the floor when I first started, I still continued to work in that direction, tumbling over quite a bit in the process, but it did eventually happen. Because you have to keep in mind, if you don't try, it's like the body just doesn't adapt if you're not just kind of putting a little bit of heat on the body. And so I will just go through a few things with the heels down. But first priority will be, of course, getting the bind and then working heels flat. I have noticed that some body types just get those heels flat really easily, real naturally. And that can sometimes do with the culture people live in because they've been already learning how to squat, and they have that opening through the hips in that position because of just past behaviors where other people who haven't done so much squatting in their past, or they were runners or marathon runners, cyclists, they might find it much more challenging to get into that squat position. I always say anything is possible, that if we've built up the opposite doing certain activities in our past, we just have to give some time to undo some of that slowly, slowly over time. And that was kind of my process because I had a very developed gastrocnemius muscle that was a bit tight. And so it was very challenging for me to be in that squat position with the heels flat when I was bound. So in Pashasana, what's interesting is that this tibialis muscle, the muscle that runs up and down the shin bone here, that this muscle begins to strengthen, whereas the gastrocnemius muscle starts to elongate, which is kind of the opposite to traditional forms of fitness. We tend to really build this muscle up and don't get it long. So that can be one of the challenges. However, if we attempt the pose, if we try to just get some experience in a squat position, it will help the body to adapt and to strengthen the areas we need to strengthen and to elongate the areas that need to elongate. Okay, let's just go ahead and go through some of the steps here. So at first, when I introduce this pose, I'm always just getting people comfortable with squatting. Bring the feet together, draw the knees together, and then even hugging the knees like this, getting the chest upright, and just getting some experience in this position. And even just in this position with no binding, you will start to feel the muscle here, the tibialis muscle, start to fire when we do this. Now, you might also feel that those heels don't flatten, even just being straight on. And that's okay. It's just going to take some time to get some deepening into the hip flexors and to get this muscle through the Achilles tendon up to the gastrocnemius muscle to elongate, and of course this muscle strengthening as well. Next is going to be to work the bind. So in Pashasana, we actually go into the left side first. So I'm going to work into the twist, going into this left direction. So when I'm preparing for the bind, it's going to be so important that I work good technique, because getting that bind around two knees is much more challenging than just one. So one thing to think about is just to really elongate the opposite side of the waist, elongate that first, initiate the twist, and then really drop the shoulder low. And if anyone has worked with me before, I'm so big with this shoulder dropping as low as possible, because it really helps to secure the bind. And then from here, shoulder low, we then need to internally rotate the shoulder joint as deeply as we can. Internally rotate. Then from here, bending the elbow to really wrap and squeeze those knees, okay? Now, because of my body proportion, I will actually lift my heels up to take the back arm around and connect, and I'm gonna grab for my wrist. I'll do the other side so you can see what I'm doing here. And then from here, I'm gonna drop the heels as I lift the chest up, looking over my shoulder and breathing. It's always hard to talk in Pashasana because it's a very, very deep twist. Okay, so the technique of the bind, the security of that bind, I find to be so integral to the pose, and it will initiate such a beautiful twist. I mean, it will be intense, but I find it's so good for the spinal column, which prepares for future back bending, and then also loosening up the shoulders, which is also very good for back bending. So some body types can be feet flat and go into the bind, while other body types might find it easier to find that bind first and then to flatten the feet. So you're going to have to kind of experiment to see what is better for you. I have a very short torso with long limbs, so my approach really works for me. Whereas I have noticed those that have longer torso, shorter legs, they can start with a flat foot position and then go into the bind. So it's just good to experiment and see what works for you. Now let me just show you on the other side, on the right side, how I'm securing the bind. So again, elongating the side of my waist, dropping the shoulder as low as possible, internally rotating the front arm as much as possible. bend the elbow. I'm squeezing my knees with my arm. I'm going to lift my heels, back arm, externally rotating. I'm going to grab for the wrist. I'm going to slide my arm down to secure a better bind here. Drop the heels as I lift the chest, gazing over my shoulder and breathing. So such a great spinal twist, such a great shoulder opener, as well as good for the hip flexion through the hips. And then release. So it definitely took me a while to get my heels flat. I did not have my heels flat in the beginning. And this is a common question that people ask me is, can I roll up my mat? Can I put my heels down on a block? What I recommend is that I'm not totally opposed to working with different tools, but you never want it to be too easy. If you don't feel the tibialis muscle firing and you don't feel the gastrocnemius muscle elongate while having something under your heels, then you might not be helping yourself to work into feet flat at some point in the future, or even deepening your hip flexion. So I just recommend, if you are going to put something under your heels, make sure you feel the muscles working. And I remember that what I did is, I actually, back in the day, I actually worked with an eye bag, you know, the ones that you kind of put over your eyes, because it gave me just enough height, but it was still pretty flat to the floor, so I could really feel my muscles working. So this is just a towel that I have, and you can also work with something like this, like folding like this, giving you just a little bit. You might need more for some of you, but I find that having something more soft under the heels versus very hard, like rolling up the mat or putting a block under your heels, it's going to kind of you're going to be resting the heels down, and it might not be really activating those muscles that you need. So sometimes I recommend just something softer to give yourself some height, to make the position more approachable to that flat foot position. However, you're getting some assistance, but the muscles are working, the muscles are activated. And what happened to me is, what I remember that then I had to put I was working with that eye bag, and then I started to work with something like a towel like this. And I remember this became too easy, so I just unfolded it. And I actually, it almost came to this flat, and it was still helping me. And when I would take this away, I would fall back still, but I knew I was getting close. So you want something that you can minimize over time, so you really feel that you're progressing. That's super, super important. So you got to keep a little bit of heat on yourself, because if you're just resting on a block, sometimes I'll come up to practitioners and be like, that looks a little too easy. So if you're a little too comfortable, you might not be doing it correctly if you're getting assistance like this. So it's just something to keep in mind when it comes to Pashasana. So again, taking a look at Pashasana, we start on the left side first. Get that shoulder down as deep as possible. Internally rotate that front arm as deep as possible. Bend the elbow to a wrap, squeeze the knees together, and then that back shoulder is super important. Really open that back shoulder to connect and bind. At first, you might just have fingers, and then over time, you can secure to taking the wrist. That would be the next stage. It'll just tighten everything up and make it even more secure. So, and then keep in mind as well that the heels flat to the floor, that might not happen right away. We want to prioritize the bind at least first and get that completed. I'm trying to remember exactly how many years it took me to get the heels flat. To get the heels flat. It took a number of years. I'm going to have to kind of go back through my timeline to remember how many years it was exactly, but it did take a while for me to get my heels flat, but it wasn't impossible. So if you cultivate patience and perseverance, persistence, anything is possible. If you never get those heels down, you're a worthwhile human being anyway. So, and the pose will still be a great thing to attempt and try. So it's all good. If there's any further questions with Pashasana, just let me know, and enjoy the practice.